Good morning there. Welcome to this morning's connection class video. It's exciting to be here again, but once again, man, I cannot wait until we can meet again face to face, live in person. What a wonderful day that's going to be. But until then, we just have to keep making do with what we can. And then, this time just kind of study some scripture together. I'm sure that I'll be reading through this passage and working through it a little bit, but you guys obviously are free to just kind of converse with one another, to share requests or share thoughts on the passage. And just as you go through. Anyhow, this morning's passage is going to be on John chapter 15, verses 9 through 14. And as we're getting there, just a word to let you know is that we are moving off of the resurrection. We spent 2 weeks there after Easter, talking about why it's true and why it matters. And this week we're going to start, I think it's 4 or 5 weeks, where we're looking at relationships and how difficult relationships are and how messy they can be and how important it is to involve our faith in our relationships and actually how to see how our faith creates the building blocks to strong relationships. So whether it's a relationship with your spouse or with your children or with coworkers or family members or neighbors or whomever it is, we're going to be looking at relationships and how our faith interacts with those kinds of relationships. Now, the first kind of building block that we're going to look at is love. It's going to be how our Christian faith influences the love that we have for one another, especially in terms of our relationships. Here in John chapter 15, what we're going to be looking at is kind of the second part of an argument. So I'll just kind of catch you up on the first part. In verses 1 through 8, we see a very famous analogy or metaphor that Jesus gives where he describes himself as a vine and that we're the branches. Some of you may have John 15:5 memorized, where Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Apart from, remain in me and you will bear much fruit, but apart from me, you can do nothing, right? So the meaning is that us as disciples and as followers of Jesus, we must remain in Jesus if we want to be productive in this world, if we want to be people who are glorifying him and living his will out on this planet. But if we separate ourselves from him, then we will then of course, we'll never reach that purpose that's there. And don't read too much into that because, like we said, it's a metaphor, it's an analogy, and all metaphors have limits, right? You can only take them so far. And Jesus realizes that, and so what he's doing here in verse 9 is he's kind of he's expanding on this vine and branches metaphor that he gives in 1:8. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. And he kind of gives us this idea, and he expands it in, and he says, well, how do you remain in me? What does it mean to remain in me? How do you remain in the Son? How do you remain in Jesus? And this is his explanation for it. So I'm just going to read for us verses 9 and 10, and then we'll keep going as we move on from there. So verse 9 says this. It says, as the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Remain in my love. Right? So first of all, he says, okay, well, if you're going to remain in me, right, as the branches that come off of my vine, if you're going to remain in me as my disciple, then it has to do with love, right? Love is the foundational principle. Love is the foundation to this relationship that you and I have with our Father, that you and I have with the Son, Jesus. He goes on and he explains it here, and he says that this kind of love that we have is not just kind of the frilly love that we see in movies or on TV shows. It's not the kind of love, right, where we just feel very strongly towards someone, and and then as soon as that love goes away, that it's something, right, that we just ditch. But rather, it's a deeper love. The example that he gives here, he says, as the Father has loved me. Now remember, Jesus is the Son. Our God is the Father, right? So there's the Heavenly Father, then there's God the Son, right? And what he's saying is, right, that as much as the Father loves the Son, and so maybe at this time, if you have children, right, then you can think that if you as a parent, as a mother, or as a father, the way that you love your son or your daughter, right, it's that kind of way. He says, as the Father has loved me, his Son, I also love you. So it is the way, right, that you love your son or your daughter. That's the way that Jesus loves us. But the difference being that Jesus is divine, you and I aren't. And so it's even deeper than that love, right? So it's even deeper than that kind of love, but that's probably as close as I think we can get to understanding the deepness of the love that the Father has for the Son, right? And that's the exact same kind of love that the Son and that the Father have for us, all right? So in verse 10, he says, if you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. Now, as you're looking at this, remember the essence here, what he's talking about is not how, right, if you can lose your salvation or if you can fall away, if you can sin so much that you're no longer connected to God, but rather, right, the big picture that he's expanding on here is what does it mean to remain in him as his disciple? What does it mean to follow him, right? And what it means is to remain in him, in his love, in obedience, right? If you keep my commands, right? That there's an essence here of following Jesus that has to do with obeying him, right? With doing the things that he has asked you to do, right? Of whenever he says, right, to love one another, to do those things. Essentially what he's going on, well, we'll get to it in a second, right? But he says that there's this issue of obedience that comes in with following. Right now, it's not just an obedience, right, that we're coming up with, but rather he moves on, right, in 10, he says, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. He says, I want you to obey me as my disciples, just like I've obeyed my Father, right? He's not asking us to do anything that he himself was not willing to do and that he himself did not do, right? We know that Jesus, right, God the Son, in his obedience, took that obedience all the way to the point and through death, right? We just covered the resurrection, that Jesus, right, lowered himself, right, to humbly obey the Father, right, to accomplish his plan for redemption for humanity, all the way to the cross, all the way to death, right? No matter what the Father asked, right? What did Jesus pray? Lord, not my will, but your will be done. Lord, I want to do what you want me to do, right? And that's the way that we're to live our life. He says, if you keep my commands, you remain in my love, right? That I want you to stay in my obedience. Now, he goes on to explain, because it would be easy for us just to kind of stop here and be like, well, Christianity is all about following the rules. As long as we follow the rules, if we do this, and this, then we're going to be okay. But there's a reason for it, right? And those of you who are parents understand this, right? And let's look at verse 11, right? Because we kind of see the reason that obedience is so important in our faith. Verse 11, he says, I've told you these things so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Now, Jesus is saying this. He says, I want you to obey me because that's the path to joy, right? That's the path, right, to me. That's how it'll be made complete. Just an example of this, just using children once again. Perhaps as you were raising your children, you told them not to touch the stove, right? Now, we all know that there's nothing. A stove in itself is just, an object that's in our kitchen, but we also know that if a stove is on, right, and if a child touches that stove and they touch that fire, right, then they're going to get burned, then they're going to get hurt, right? And so what do? We set the rule and we say, okay, whatever you do, just don't touch the stove. Now, once the child gets older, they become a teenager or an older child, right, then they can kind of they can help you cook, and they can start messing with the stove, but the point of staying away from the stove is not that the stove is just something that you never touch, but rather your point is you don't want your child to be hurt, right? And this is kind of what we see here, right, with Jesus. He says, I've told you these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. That Jesus tells us all kinds of things. He gives us rules to follow, right? Not necessarily because he wants to set these big things that are just on the side, but rather he wants to protect us. That Jesus wants to protect us from the things in this world that can hurt us, right? And if he can protect us from these things, right, then our joy will be made complete, right? How much easier is it to go through by learning, right, from someone else's mistakes than from making those mistakes on your own, right? Or how much better is it just to obey and to not make the mistake in the first place, right? And then just say, look, I never had to experience that because I obeyed, right? I was about to tell an example about my sister, but I'm not going to drag her into this. So just moving on there, right, is that as we see in our life, and as we see as believers too, this also plays out for us. Just like as your child sometimes, right, they inevitably touch the stove, they get burned and they get hurt, right, and then you wrap your arms and you love them, right? How many of us know that there's a sin or that there's something in our life that we shouldn't do, but we've done it anyhow, and then we find ourselves burned and we find ourselves miserable because we're in disobedience to the Lord, right? And so this is the reason, right? If we obey him, then we remain in this love, then we remain, right, connected to him. And he has told us these things so that joy may be in us, and that his joy and that our joy may be complete. Right now, so he sets this basis. He says that the basis of being a disciple is love, right? It's love me, and with love comes obedience, right? You obey the people that you love, right? You may just work for the boss that you hate, but if you really love your boss, then you're just going to do what he asks you to do because you love him, right, or her, or whomever it is. But here we go, and what Jesus is going to do is he's going to transition this some, and he says, okay, now that we've established this love, right, that you have for the Father and that I have for you, right? Well, I want you to take this love further, right? And that's what we see in verse 12. He says, this is my command. He says, so once again, right, this is a command. He says, so obey me, stay in this obedience. He says, this is my command, love one another as I have loved you. So what he says here, he says, in these relationships that you find yourself in, when you're around other members of the church, right, when you're around your spouses, around your children, around your friends, your co-workers, he says, this is my command, that same love that I have for you, the same love that the Father has for the Son, I want you to love one another in that way, right? And so one of the very first foundational building blocks of our relationships is this kind of love, this great over-exceeding love. And he goes on to give the example, right, of how far and how deep this love goes in verse 13, where he says, and no one has greater love than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. Right? He says this is more than just the simple I love you. This is more than the I feel really strongly about you today. This is a love that is deep down, committed to the other person in the deepest parts of your heart, of your mind, and your soul, and your body. It is so deep that you look at the other person and you say, I will lay down my life for you. Right? And once again, these are not just words that Jesus says. This is an example that Jesus sets. Right? This is the example that Jesus sets where he looks at us and he says, I love you so much that I'm going to die on the cross so that you can be made right with the Father, so that you can have a pathway to salvation, right? So it'll be proven that I am the way and the truth and the life, and that you can make it to the Father through me. He says, this is the kind of love that you are to have for your brothers and for your sisters. No one has greater love than this, than to lay down his life for his friends, right? And so we see that this is a way deeper love than we see in movies. It's a way deeper love than our culture, right, tends to display love. It's a deeper love, honestly, than a lot of people approach marriage. There's this feeling of love, and you fall in and out of that feeling as time kind of goes. But this love is deeper than a feeling. It's a commitment to one another. It's a commitment that says, no matter how I feel about you today, no matter how I feel about you tomorrow, or the day after that, or the day after that, or the day after that, I will continue to love you. No matter what, I love you. It's a commitment to love. It's not a feeling, right, that's wishy-washy, that goes away and comes back, but rather it is a commitment to love, right? And so whenever you're in whenever we're in our relationships, if your spouse makes you upset, if Joe Bob here at the church is just being a jerk, right? It's a deep commitment where we say, I'm not feeling this feeling of love, but I am committed to loving you right now. And we're going to do what it takes to keep our relationship going, to move forward in this relationship. Verse 14, and you are my friends if you do what I command. See, this is the kind of culmination. Actually, he keeps going here where he says that this is the commitment, right? That you're my friends, you're remaining in me if you do what I command. And what am I commanding you to do? I'm commanding you to love in a deep, personal way that goes way deeper than feelings, but goes deep down to the action even of laying your life down for your friends. And so, church, you guys are going to just continue talking about this in your discussion groups. But just remember, this first basis of our relationships, right, of a solid Christian relationship is found in a deep love for one another. And that this deep love for one another is founded in the deep love that the Father has for the Son and that the Son showed to us on the cross. So thank you. You have a great week. And we'll look forward to doing this again with you.